I'm Sophie Lewis.
I'm Jenny Higgins.
We co-translated Faces on the Tip of My Tongue by Pagano, and we're going to read the beginning of a story that we call Just a Dad, which is number 8 in the collection that was published by Peirene. One of the reasons we've chosen it is that it's a central story in this collection and in the original collection, which was published as Un renard à mains nues, which can be translated as a fox with bare hands. And as you'll see, this is the central incident in the story and a central incident in the whole collection. And the character who is the little girl that we're about to read about returns in several other stories in different ways, and you see her character as an adult reflected in different ways after this incident and through the eyes of others. Jenny, I think, will read in French first.
Yeah, I'll just read the first short paragraph in French and then we'll switch into English. Juste un papa. Petite fille, je devais voir le scie, parce que j'avais tué un renard à mains nues. J'étais bien d'accord, moi, mais d'abord le scie, je ne le voyais pas, il me tournait le dos. Et ensuite, c'était pas si terrible pour le renard. Enfin si, mais je croyais bien faire. Il était pris au piège et n'était pas parvenu à se dégager. Il était mourant. Je n'ai fait que presser sa nuque fort en pleurant pour que ça finisse plus vite, pour desserrer le collet de sanglots qui m'étranglait.
When I was a little girl, I had to see a therapist because I'd killed a fox with my bare hands. I was happy to go along with it, but I never really saw the therapist because he always had his back to me. And in any case, it wasn't all that bad, the thing with the fox. Or at least it was bad, but I thought I was doing the right thing. It was caught in a trap and couldn't get away. It was dying, and I just pressed its neck hard, crying the whole time, to make it die more quickly, to loosen the snare of sobs that was choking me. My parents had just separated, and then there was the business with the fox, and my age, 9. So there was no getting round it, off to the shrink for me. Mum was annoyingly keen on arranging everything just right. She was frighteningly well organised, and the therapist was the same. So between them, they worked out a way of getting the most from our journeys back and forth. Dad had stayed up high in the mountains, where we all used to live together when everything was still all right. And Mum had moved down to the bottom, to a village in the valley where the weather was milder. I lived with Dad during the week, and every weekend it felt as though I was swapping seasons. On Fridays after school, Dad took me to Mum's house, and Mum drove me back up on Sunday evenings. I'd be reunited with the winter, and with my dead tree, the one that fell down shortly before the divorce, and that I used to play in until dusk and sometimes long after. I'd made a den in its huge trunk. That tree had been famous for a while. Someone had even written a book about it. When the therapist called to fix a time for my appointments, he mentioned that he drove up to see another child in a village halfway along the mountain road on Fridays. So Mum seized on that straight away. Couldn't they meet there, my dad and my therapist, halfway, and make use of the journey? He would pick me up in that village, and the session would take place in the car as we drove down to Mum's house.
The therapist was a transition between Dad and Mum, and I really didn't like the way he drove, not a bit. He used to pick me up as arranged at the midpoint, and I'd be worrying about all the twists and turns in the road before we even set off. We would talk without looking at one another. There I was, imprisoned in the car seat, held fast by the seatbelt, telling his back all about my misfortunes. As we wound along the mountain road, a slight nausea permeated my words. The therapist wasn't a good driver, and he didn't negotiate the bends as well as my parents did. The downward plunges frightened me. And anyway, being in the car with a man who was almost a stranger driving in front of me brought back bad memories of a time when I'd been afraid, so horribly afraid that I forgot to be afraid of the scolding that would follow. The fox was grey. That winter had been extremely cold, and the fox had a very thick coat, with long, almost white hairs on the outside and a thick, much darker, downy layer underneath, like a sort of warm shadow. It had stopped struggling when I found it, and had wrapped itself up in its thick winter tail as though to sleep. But it wasn't sleeping, it was dying. It gave off a strong smell of urine and violets, as all foxes do, but this smell went far beyond the usual flowery whiff. It was the smell of panic. The smell was what led me to it. Apart from that, it was just a grey hollow in the snow. When I lifted it up, I saw that its body was black with blood underneath, where the snare had sunk deep into the flesh. It tried to bite me, but so slowly that I could tell it was already far gone beyond fear, just waiting. But this just waiting was horrible. I held it to me and felt the faint beating of its heart. I couldn't manage to loosen the snare, which sliced straight through my gloves, and anyway, I didn't want to free it. It was too late. I tried to use the metal wire to finish it off, but it was impossible. I took off my shredded gloves and strangled it with my bare, frozen hands. Before I did it, I stared at my gloves for a long time. They weren't gloves anymore, just padded tatters. I wasn't afraid of what Dad would say, not at all, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from those rags, torn to shreds like the fox's coat. And my hands, too. I looked at my hands, bizarrely white and intact. The fingers of my gloves were damaged, but I was unscathed. I just had cold hands. My hands, fingers, palms, nails, wrists, all were smooth, firm, pale, and naked. I looked at my torn gloves and my ungloved hands, my bare hands. I put them on the fox's neck as though to warm them, or to warm it. I squeezed as hard as a girl my age could.